Normandy, June 1944. While thousands died on blood-soaked beaches, one British sergeant sat in a crater, brewing tea with trembling hands. The tin rattled against his mess kit, a sound that would echo through military history for reasons no one could have predicted. What happened next defied every tactical manual written, proving that sometimes the most British solution is the most effective one. 23 enemy soldiers would surrender that afternoon, not to superior firepower, but to something far more unexpected. The morning of June 8, 1944, arrived with the stench of cordite and wet earth. Sergeant William Hargreaves, 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment, crouched in a shell crater 3 miles inland from Sword Beach. The crater measured roughly 12 feet across, its edges still smoking from the explosion that created it 90 minutes earlier. Rain had begun at 0430 hours, turning French soil into clinging mud that weighed down every step, every breath. The temperature hovered around 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Hargreaves could hear distant artillery, a constant drumbeat that had become the soundtrack to existence itself. Around him lay the remnants of his section, 7 men, now reduced to 4. Private Collins had caught shrapnel in the initial bombardment. Lance Corporal Davies and Private Thompson had been cut down by machine gun fire, attempting to flank a German position now silent and abandoned. The survivors huddled in the crater, weapons ready, watching the tree line 60 yards north, where movement had been reported. Hargreaves was 42 years old, a factory foreman from Nottingham who had joined up in 1939 despite being technically too old. His hands, scarred from 20 years working industrial machinery, now gripped a Lee Enfield rifle with the same steady competence he had once applied to assembly lines. His face, weathered and lined, showed no panic. His men looked to him because he possessed something increasingly rare: the ability to think clearly when death whispered from every direction. The tactical situation was impossible by any conventional measure. Intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. What was supposed to be a lightly defended sector had revealed itself as a strongly fortified German fallback position. The battalion's advance had stalled completely. Communications were severed when a mortar strike destroyed their radio. They were cut off, surrounded by bocage hedgerows that turned every field into a potential kill zone, facing an enemy whose strength and disposition remained unknown. The statistics were grimly clear. In the 48 hours since landing, the battalion had suffered 37% casualties. Standard doctrine called for withdrawal, but withdrawal meant crossing 800 yards of open ground under observed fire. They had tried twice already. Both attempts had ended, with men screaming in the mud, medics unable to reach them. The German position ahead was methodically efficient. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Mortar teams had the range precisely calculated. Snipers waited with patience, born of professional training. Every tactical option led to the same conclusion. Attempting to advance meant dying, attempting to retreat meant dying, staying put meant dying slowly as ammunition ran out, and German infantry inevitably counterattacked. Private Edwards, 19 years old from Liverpool, his face still carrying teenage softness despite 3 weeks of combat, kept glancing at Hargreaves with barely concealed desperation. Corporal Ashworth, a Yorkshireman built like a brick privy, maintained stoic silence, methodically checking his rifle for the 100th time. Private Morrison, a former bank clerk from Edinburgh, whose spectacles sat perpetually crooked on his muddy face, scribbled coordinates on a scrap of paper with mechanical precision, as if proper bookkeeping could impose order on chaos. At 0847 hours, Hargreaves made a decision that defied everything the army had taught him. He reached into his webbing and extracted his tea tin, a battered metal container that had survived North Africa, Sicily, and now Normandy. The tin bore dents from a dozen near misses, its original paint worn to bare metal. Inside sat loose tea leaves, carefully rationed, representing civilization in a world gone mad. He announced quietly, his Nottingham accent thick as factory smoke, that he was going to brew tea. The men stared at him with expressions suggesting their sergeant had finally cracked under pressure. Morrison actually asked if he was feeling all right. Hargreaves simply replied that if they were going to die in a French crater, they would die as Englishmen, with proper tea. He gathered fragments of wood from a shattered cart, arranged them with deliberate care, and struck a match. The tiny flame seemed absurdly fragile against the backdrop of industrial warfare. He filled his mess tin with rainwater collected in his helmet, set it over the flame, and waited for it to boil. The ritual possessed hypnotic quality. Measure the tea leaves, wait for proper steeping time. Pour carefully despite shaking hands. The smell of brewing tea cut through cordite and death. Steam rose from the mess tin, visible in the grey morning air. Hargreaves poured 4 cups with ceremonial precision, passing them to his men. They drank in silence, the hot liquid burning throats raw from shouting and fear. For 60 seconds, they were not soldiers trapped in a crater facing death. They were Englishmen having tea, maintaining standards because standards were what separated civilization from barbarism. What Hargreaves did not realize, could not have realized, was that 140 yards ahead, in a concrete bunker concealed beneath hedgerow and camouflage netting, 23 German soldiers had been watching through binoculars. They had been preparing to launch the counterattack that would wipe out this isolated British position. But the sight of men brewing tea under fire had introduced an element their tactical training had never addressed. The senior German NCO, Feldwebel Klaus Richter, a veteran of Russia and Africa, lowered his binoculars slowly. His expression had shifted from professional calculation to genuine confusion. For 15 minutes, he had watched British soldiers perform an act that made absolutely no tactical sense whatsoever, displaying either supreme confidence or complete insanity. The psychological impact was far more profound than Richter could articulate. These men were not desperate. They were not defeated. They were drinking tea in the middle of a battlefield, as if attending a garden party, interrupted by inconvenient weather. The German position had been established 3 days prior, during the frantic reorganization following the Allied landings. Feldwebel Klaus Richter commanded 23 men occupying a reinforced bunker system built during the initial Atlantic Wall construction. The bunkers represented German engineering at its methodical best. 6 feet of reinforced concrete, fields of fire calculated to the inch, ammunition stored in waterproof containers, communications wire buried 3 feet deep. Richter was 36 years old, a career soldier who had joined the Wehrmacht in 1934. His face bore the permanent squint of men who had spent years scanning hostile horizons. Russia had taught him that warfare was industrial process. Identify enemy, apply superior force, eliminate resistance with mechanical efficiency. The Eastern Front had burned away any romantic notions about combat, leaving only pragmatic calculation of tonnage, casualty ratios, and logistical sustainability. His men represented cross-section of German military experience. 5 were veterans of Russia, hardened by combat that had redefined human endurance. 8 were replacements from garrison duty in France, adequately trained but lacking combat experience. 10 were teenagers conscripted 6 weeks ago, frightened boys wearing uniforms too large, trying desperately to appear confident. The veterans watched the replacements with mixture of pity and resigned acceptance that most would be dead within a month. The tactical situation favored the Germans, absolutely. They held elevated position with clear fields of fire. Their ammunition was adequate for sustained defensive operations. Morale remained reasonably solid, despite news of American breakouts to the west. The British section in the crater represented isolated target, presenting no meaningful threat. Standard procedure was to eliminate them with mortar fire, then advance to confirm kills and collect intelligence documents. Richter had been preparing precisely that operation when the British sergeant began brewing tea. The psychological impact of this action rippled through the bunker like shockwave through water. The veterans initially assumed it was tactical deception, some kind of feint before desperate breakout attempt. But as minutes passed and the British soldiers simply sat drinking tea with apparent contentment, confusion deepened into something approaching cognitive dissonance. German military doctrine emphasized aggressive action, decisive violence, and overwhelming force. The entire philosophical foundation of Wehrmacht tactical thinking rested on seizing initiative through calculated brutality. What they were observing contradicted this framework so completely that it created genuine intellectual paralysis. These British soldiers were not behaving like trapped men facing imminent death. They were behaving like they had already won and were merely waiting for formalities to conclude. One of the younger soldiers, Gefreiter Hans Weber, 18 years old from Munich, asked in bewildered tone whether the British were insane. Richter had no answer. He had fought against the Red Army, which attacked with fanatic determination. He had fought against Americans who relied on material superiority, but he had never encountered enemy that responded to tactical crisis by stopping for tea. The Russian veterans in the bunker understood something the replacements did not. On the Eastern Front, they had learned that men who appeared unconcerned by death were either already dead inside or possessed reserves of morale that made them exceptionally dangerous. The British sergeant's casual attitude suggested someone who had made peace with mortality, which meant he might attempt anything. Such men could not be predicted because they had stopped playing by rational rules. At 09:23 hours, Hargreaves stood up in the crater. His men froze, certain their sergeant had finally succumbed to combat fatigue. Hargreaves brushed mud from his battle dress with fastidious care, straightened his helmet to parade ground precision, and began walking toward the German position. He carried his rifle slung over one shoulder, barrel pointing down. In his right hand he carried his tea tin, steam still rising from the fresh brew he had just prepared. His walk was deliberate, measured, the stride of a factory foreman crossing the shop floor to address a problem. He did not run, he did not crouch. He walked upright, boots squelching in the mud, toward a fortified position containing 23 armed soldiers who had been preparing to kill him 60 seconds earlier. In the bunker, chaos erupted in hushed German curses. 3 soldiers raised weapons, fingers tightening on triggers. Richter barked an order to hold fire, his voice sharp with authority born of a dozen campaigns. Something was happening here that defied his experience, and his combat instinct screamed that shooting this man would be a mistake of catastrophic proportions. Hargreaves stopped 30 yards from the bunker, clearly visible, absolutely vulnerable. He raised the tea tin in what could only be described as gesture of offering. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the morning air with the same matter-of-fact tone he had used for 20 years, telling workers that their shift was ending. He announced in English, knowing they might not understand the words but would certainly understand the tone, that he had brewed extra tea, that it was proper English breakfast tea, that it would be a shame to waste it, and that if they were interested in surrendering, he would be happy to share. He added with timing that would have worked in a music hall that the alternative was he would have to call in artillery, which would be inconvenient for everyone, particularly as it would ruin the tea. The absurdity of the moment created crack in the fabric of military reality. Richter stared at this man standing in the open, offering tea to enemy soldiers preparing to kill him, speaking with the casual confidence of someone inviting neighbors for Sunday dinner. The Wehrmacht Tactical Manual, comprehensive document covering every conceivable combat scenario, had absolutely no procedure for responding to enemy offering refreshments during active combat operations. The younger soldiers looked to Richter for guidance. The veterans recognized the psychological warfare being conducted, though its mechanism remained unclear. One thing was certain. This British sergeant had seized initiative more completely than any tactical maneuver could have achieved. He had transformed the engagement from military confrontation into social situation, and military training had not prepared anyone for negotiating social obligations with enemy combatants. The silence that followed Hargreaves's offer stretched across the cratered landscape like fog across moorland. Inside the bunker, 23 German soldiers faced psychological crisis unprecedented in their combat experience. Feldwebel Richter found himself confronting decision that existed outside any doctrinal framework. How does one respond when enemy transforms battlefield into invitation for tea? The tactical mathematics remained unchanged. The Germans held superior position with overwhelming firepower advantage. One burst from the MG-42 would cut down the British sergeant where he stood. Standard operating procedure was crystal clear. Eliminate hostile combatant displaying suspicious behavior, secure the area, continue defensive operations. But something profound had shifted in the psychological architecture of the engagement. Gefreiter Weber, the youngest soldier, whispered that perhaps they should hear what the British sergeant wanted. One of the Russian veterans, Obergefreiter Franz Dietrich, a scarred man from Saxony whose eyes had seen too much, replied quietly that what the sergeant wanted was obvious. He wanted them to surrender. The question was why he believed they would. Richter's mind raced through possibilities. Was this elaborate ruse concealing flanking attack? He scanned the surrounding terrain through his binoculars, searching for signs of British reinforcements. The fields remained empty, except for corpses from previous engagements. Was the sergeant genuinely insane? Possible. Combat fatigue affected men unpredictably, but his demeanor suggested complete sanity, which made his actions even more disturbing. The critical factor Richter could not dismiss was the implication of supreme confidence. The sergeant was standing exposed, utterly vulnerable, acting as if outcome was already decided in his favor. This suggested either hidden strength or complete bluff. German intelligence had emphasized that British forces were overstretched, understrength, suffering heavy casualties. But this man showed no indication of weakness whatsoever. Richter had learned brutal lesson on the Eastern Front. Never underestimate enemy who appears unconcerned by death. Such men possessed psychological advantages that translated into tactical realities. They took risks rational soldiers avoided. They executed operations that seemed impossible. They won engagements through sheer refusal to accept defeat. The sergeant's casual offer of tea demonstrated precisely that mentality. At 0931 hours, Hargreaves called out again. His tone remained conversational, almost friendly. He mentioned that the tea was getting cold, which would be terrible waste. He added that he understood they were professional soldiers doing their duty, that he respected that, but that the war was clearly reaching its conclusion, that Germany was losing, and that dying for lost cause seemed rather pointless when good tea was available. The words struck like artillery rounds at the foundation of German morale. Every man in the bunker knew the strategic situation. They had heard rumors of massive American breakouts, of German forces retreating throughout France, of Allied air superiority so complete that daylight movement was suicide. The Reich's propaganda insisted on final victory, but soldiers understood mathematics of attrition. Germany was being ground down by enemies possessing unlimited industrial capacity and manpower reserves that could not be matched. The younger soldiers, conscripted recently, had not yet developed psychological armor of veterans. They were terrified 19-year-olds who had been told they were defending civilization, discovering instead that they were dying for a regime that had already lost. The sergeant's words articulated thoughts they had not dared speak aloud. This was finished. Continuing only meant dying for nothing. Surrender offered survival. The Russian veterans were harder cases. They had witnessed what happened to German soldiers captured by the Red Army. They had seen the retaliation for Wehrmacht atrocities committed during the invasion. They knew that Eastern Front prisoners faced grim fates in Soviet camps. But this was Western Front. British and Americans followed Geneva Convention. Surrender here meant prisoner of war camps, possibly survival until war's end, eventual return home. Dietrich spoke quietly, addressing Richter with respect of subordinate who has fought beside his commander through hell. He suggested that perhaps they should consider the sergeant's offer. They were cut off from battalion support. Their ammunition, while adequate for defensive operations, would not last against sustained assault. Allied artillery would eventually destroy this position, as it had destroyed every other defensive position along the invasion front. They could die here achieving nothing, or they could survive to see Germany again when this madness ended. Richter felt the weight of command crashing down like bunker ceiling preparing to collapse. 23 lives depended on his decision. The military obligation was clear. Resist to the last round, deny the enemy any easy victory, inflict maximum casualties. But beneath the formal duty lay human calculation. These were men, many barely old enough to shave, whose lives would be snuffed out accomplishing nothing beyond adding tallies to casualty statistics that no one would remember in 50 years. He thought of his own family in Stuttgart, his wife and 2 daughters living under Allied bombing campaigns that grew more devastating each month. He thought of his brother, killed at Stalingrad, defending position that was abandoned 3 days later. He thought of Russia, of frozen corpses stacked like cordwood, of men dying for objectives that were meaningless variations on maps. At 09:37 hours, Richter made his decision. He stood up slowly, raising his hands to show he carried no weapon. The action caused immediate tension throughout the bunker. Several soldiers raised weapons instinctively. Richter ordered them to stand down, his voice carrying absolute authority. He walked toward the bunker entrance, emerging into the grey Norman morning. Hargreaves watched the German NCO appear, noted the Iron Cross, the combat badges, the bearing of professional soldier. He nodded politely, as if greeting colleague at factory entrance. He held up the tea tin questioningly. Richter, operating on instinct that transcended language barriers, nodded once. Hargreaves poured a cup, steam rising, and walked forward to hand it to his enemy. Richter accepted the cup, felt its warmth against hands that had been cold for days. He took a sip. The tea was strong, properly brewed, exactly as civilized beverage should be. The mundane normality of this action, performed on battlefields surrounded by death, created cognitive dislocation so profound that reality seemed to bend. The 2 NCOs stood 5 feet apart, sergeant and Feldwebel, British and German, enemy combatants sharing tea in shell-cratered field. Neither spoke for 30 seconds. Then Richter said in careful English, learned from school textbooks 2 decades ago, that the tea was very good. Hargreaves replied that Yorkshire tea was always good, even in France, even during wars, especially during wars. Richter asked the question that mattered: what happens if we surrender? Hargreaves's response was delivered with same matter-of-fact tone he had used for everything. They would be treated as prisoners of war under Geneva Convention. They would be searched for weapons. They would be given medical attention if needed. They would be processed through POW camps. They would be fed adequately. They would survive the war. They would eventually go home. And he added with slight smile, they would get more tea. At 0954 hours on June 8, 1944, 23 German soldiers emerged from their bunker with hands raised, weapons abandoned, following Feldwebel Klaus Richter into captivity. Sergeant William Hargreaves accepted their surrender with the same understated efficiency he had once applied to managing factory shifts. He detailed Private Morrison to collect weapons, instructed Corporal Ashworth to search prisoners for intelligence documents, and sent Private Edwards running back to battalion lines to report the situation. The reaction from British command was initial disbelief, followed by cautious verification. A lieutenant arrived 30 minutes later, expecting to find combat situation, discovering instead captured Germans sitting in orderly rows, drinking tea from mess tins, while Hargreaves explained proper brewing technique through combination of English, gestures, and universal language of beverage preparation. The lieutenant filed a report that was flagged as possibly exaggerated, investigated by intelligence officers, and eventually confirmed through prisoner interrogation. The capture yielded significant intelligence value. The German position had contained detailed maps of defensive preparations throughout the sector, communications codes that remained current for another 48 hours, and tactical assessments of Wehrmacht strength that proved invaluable for planning subsequent operations. More importantly, it removed 23 enemy soldiers from combat without firing a single shot, avoiding casualties that would have resulted from conventional assault. The immediate tactical impact rippled through the sector. The bunker position had been key defensive strongpoint anchoring German line. Its loss forced Wehrmacht units to withdraw to secondary positions, creating gap that British forces exploited within 12 hours. The 2nd Battalion advanced 3 miles by June 10th, objectives that had been projected to require a week of heavy fighting. The unexpected surrender had opened a hole in German defences precisely when Allied command needed breakthrough to maintain invasion momentum. But the deeper significance lay in the psychological demonstration of principle that military theorists would study for decades afterward. Hargreaves had instinctively understood something that transcended tactical doctrine. Warfare was not merely exchange of firepower, but contest of wills, and psychological victories could be more decisive than physical ones. By refusing to accept the role of desperate soldier facing inevitable death, by instead projecting absolute confidence through absurdly British act of brewing tea, he had undermined enemy morale more effectively than any artillery barrage. The German soldiers, when interrogated, repeatedly mentioned the psychological impact of watching British troops drinking tea under fire. It suggested reserves of confidence, reinforcements waiting beyond visual range, artillery support ready to be called down, officers so certain of victory that they could afford to pause for refreshments. None of this was true. But perception shaped reality more powerfully than facts, and Hargreaves had manipulated perception with skill that would have impressed propaganda specialists. The story spread through the British Army with the velocity of particularly good gossip. It was embellished, modified, retold around campfires and in bivouacs throughout the Normandy campaign. Some versions had Hargreaves capturing 50 Germans. Others claimed he offered them biscuits as well. The core narrative remained consistent. British sergeant with tea tin accomplishing through sheer psychological audacity what might have required platoon-strength assault with heavy casualties. Hargreaves himself received military medal for the action. Presented in brief ceremony 6 weeks later, the citation noted his initiative, courage, and unconventional tactical thinking. He accepted the decoration with characteristic understatement, mentioning primarily that the tea had indeed been quite good, and that shame to waste it on account of Germans. When pressed by war correspondents for dramatic details, he explained patiently that he had simply assessed the situation, concluded that asking politely might work better than shooting, and that British approach to problems generally involved tea at some point. The incident was documented in official battalion histories, analyzed in post-war tactical studies, and eventually became footnote in larger narratives of Normandy campaign. But for those who understood its implications, it represented something profound about British character under pressure. The refusal to abandon civilized norms, even in uncivilized circumstances. The application of practical common sense to impossible situations, and the conviction that there was no problem so severe that it could not be addressed with proper cup of tea. Hargreaves survived the war, returned to Nottingham, resumed his position as factory foreman. He rarely spoke of his military service, considering it interruption of normal life rather than defining experience. The tea tin that had precipitated the surrender sat on his mantelpiece, battered and dented, until his death in 1967. His family donated it to the Imperial War Museum, where it remains on display, small metal container representing triumph of psychology over firepower. Klaus Richter spent remainder of war in POW camp in Yorkshire, ironically drinking tea daily, treated correctly under Geneva Convention. He returned to Germany in 1947, finding Stuttgart heavily damaged, but his family intact. He rarely discussed his surrender, though in later years he would mention to his grandchildren that sometimes the bravest decision is knowing when to stop fighting. He died in 1982, having lived long enough to see Germany rebuilt, European Union formed, and the hatreds of war gradually fading into historical memory. The 23 soldiers who surrendered that morning scattered across post-war Germany, returning to interrupted lives, rebuilding nation from ruins. Most never spoke publicly about incident, considering it minor episode in catastrophic conflict. But several, in private moments decades later, would acknowledge to family that the British sergeant with the tea tin had saved their lives through gesture that transcended warfare, offering enemy soldiers basic human dignity when military logic demanded only violence. The lesson of Hargreaves's tea tin endured beyond individual participants. Military academies studied the incident as example of psychological warfare. Leadership courses used it to illustrate importance of confidence under pressure, but perhaps most significantly, it entered British cultural mythology as perfect encapsulation of national character, the ability to remain utterly, ridiculously British, regardless of circumstances, to maintain standards when standards seemed irrelevant, to transform crisis into social occasion, and to win through sheer, stubborn refusal to behave as if losing was even possible. The story affirmed something essential about the nature of courage, that it manifests not only in charging machine guns or enduring artillery bombardment, but in the small acts of normalcy maintained against chaos. Hargreaves's decision to brew tea was not escape from reality, but assertion of values worth fighting for. Civilization, he demonstrated wordlessly, was not defined by grand gestures, but by insistence on maintaining human decency when abandoning it would be easier. That a dented metal tea tin could represent such profound principle seemed perfectly appropriate. The British have always understood that smallest objects often carry largest meanings, that a proper cup of tea represents not just beverage, but entire philosophy of how to confront an unreasonable world with reasonable grace. If this story resonated with you, reminded you why we honor those who served with such quiet courage, please do consider subscribing to our channel. We uncover these forgotten stories of British ingenuity, resilience, and that peculiar ability to remain utterly British in the most impossible circumstances. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did you know anyone who served in Normandy? Do you have family stories of similar resourcefulness? We read every comment and learn from your contributions. Until next time, keep calm, carry on, and never underestimate the power of a proper cup of tea.